Hello and welcome to The Scoop, our weekly Henry Jackson Society discussion on the threats facing the Western world, being broadcast to you live from Millbank Tower in the heart of Westminster. While others are keen to play down the threats facing our democracy, values and societies, here we promise to give you the truth, straight and unvarnished. Just as importantly, we pledge to involve you, our audience too. This show is not about us talking and you listening. Instead, if you've got something to say, you can click the link in the video description just under where you're watching. You'll be redirected to our online studio and might get to ask one live. I can't promise we'll agree with you if you're called, but I can tell you we'll certainly engage with your point of view. Today, we're sticking with the theme of the invasion of Ukraine that we've discussed for the last 2 weeks. With Vladimir Putin making very slow progress with his military assault, and his forces resorting to increasingly desperate attacks against civilians in order to crush Ukraine's brave resistance. I'll be asking where the conflict heads next, and whether we are doing enough in the West to roll back Russia's aggression. Joining me at HGS Towers to discuss this subject is Strategic Relations Manager Aliona Hlivco and Ukrainian diplomat Yuliia Osmolovska. The keener observers of you will have noticed that I am not Alan Mendoza, who is unfortunately unwell with COVID. My name is Sam Armstrong, HGS's Director of Communications, and I'm pleased to be taking us through this ever important discussion. But please don't forget, we want to hear from you during the show with your thoughts. To ask your question live, please again, click through on the link in the description or visit henryjacksonsociety.org/the scoop. And we will do our best to bring you into the discussion. Well, to begin our discussion, Yuliia, if I might, the fog of war has really descended over much of what's going on, and it's really hard to see, and for many at home, to see what is going on. What's the latest, just broad brushstrokes of where this conflict is within Ukraine?
Well, it's probably the hardest question that I'm hearing today, because there are so plenty developments and so different aspects of this conflict, actually of this war, Russian war in Ukraine, as we call it, that it's very difficult to give you update on the recent developments on all the broad age. Let me just sketch on some important issues so far, and then we can develop this into discussion. So the first and foremost, the question which is puzzling almost all people in the world, where the conflict ends, where there might be some sort of solution. And definitely everybody expects to have some sort of mindful negotiations and some agreements which would be acceptable for both sides. With regard to negotiations, I have to say that there are current quite intense consultations between Ukrainian and Russian sides. However, the level of representation is not very high. So these are obviously not the decision makers, especially from Russian side. Level of advisor to the President Putin with the name Medinsky, who was not branded as a good negotiator, didn't appear a lot previously. So this is a question how confident they are and capable to frame some of the agreements. And also what we see from tactics that Russians are playing, they're trying to give more intense, more aggressive shelling of civilian sites, causing terror, and thus inducing the Ukrainian side to be ready to compromise on some crucial issues during negotiations. So this is probably the most important issue at the moment. And at the same time, Russians are also keeping to raise stakes, threatening by using tactical nuclear bombs, by using nuclear power plants as hostages.
And do you think that is really a tactic that could be used? I mean, the first use in conflict of nuclear weapons since 1945.
Yes, I think that Russians in such a desperate position right now that they don't have a lot of tools available for them to blackmail West and Ukraine to give up, or at least to do some mindful concessions, so that they are ready to do anything. And they've already came through the point of no return, and even if they stop right now, still the investigations in international criminal courts and all other instruments of bringing Russia to response, I think that they will be in the use, and Russians definitely understand this. Therefore, they're just following these brinkmanship tactics. That's it.
Truly shocking stuff. And Aliona, one of the factors that's causing most fear or consternation, I suppose, in the Kremlin is the fate of this so-called column of Russian forces making its way incredibly slowly towards Kyiv. There's suggestions that the Russian army has been henceforth unable to get supplies to the front. Is that the situation? Are we just a few days away from that front of that column being starved out almost?
Well, luckily for Ukraine, I think the logistics was always the weakest side to Russian army. It's been well known, it's been inherited since Soviet Union, and now the case goes the same for the Russian army. The logistics are their weakest point, and I think the weak logistics actually prevented for the column to move further into Kyiv quickly. They're very spread out. The supply chain cannot keep up with all of the troops moving into Kyiv. And it's also quite disruptive, the approach that the Russian army is using logistically, which is top to bottom, not bottom to top, as the normal Western country would do. So basically, it's not what the troops on the ground are requiring. That's not the thing that's being provided for them. It's rather the top, the leadership of the army says to them, okay, this is what we have. They provided for the troops, and you have to make do with it. That's why it's completely ineffective.
And is that a reflection of kind of the wider societal differences? Here in the West, the top answers to the people. In Russia, of course, the people answer to those on the top. Is Russia kind of being damned by its own political culture and philosophy of how to rule?
Of course, 100%. Once you have a dictatorship, it's being reflected in all levels, at all levels of society, of governing, and just structure of the state.
And the feeling is that, from what you were saying, Yuliia, that as Russia does worse in the war, the irony is that maybe they're going to get more and more violent. And we've seen just in the past few days, Western journalists, some I have to say, I have met, that come to this very building, filmed Henry Jackson Society spokesmen, were killed and have had their legs blown off in Ukraine. Is Putin increasingly just going to throw hell to leather and just go for it and attack anyone, and have his army attack anyone or anything that moves?
Yes, I think they still count on tactics to threaten the West and to raise fear of further escalation, thus forcing Western partners to put pressure on Ukrainian government to do some concessions and to stop this resistance, this war, as soon as possible. Therefore, they don't care, they don't count the victims, and especially it was quite illustrative with their own dead soldiers that were not even picked up, and some of the wounded soldiers were just shot down by their comrades. So this is quite a cruel campaign, and we have to face it as real as it is.
And Yuliia and Aliona, you're both Ukrainian. You both have family and friends and people you know there. Can I just ask you, just personally speaking, how does it feel, both of you, just to see violence being meted out on a country that you know and love? How's that to watch from afar?
It's not watch from afar. I just traveled to UK to talk to people and to show the latest information, but I'll be traveling back to Ukraine. And my heart is definitely in pain, both for my family, which is scattered all over the country, and I can't feel secure for them in any city in Ukraine, even in Western regions. And also my heart is in pain for all the other Ukrainians, because we as an institution, Transatlantic Dialogue Center, comprise an informal network of similar institutions adjacent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense. And our task is to disseminate this information on a daily basis to all international media and analytical centers and politicians' outlets. And every day I have to process all these pictures of dead children, of broken houses and all this stuff. So it's really hard emotional task, extremely hard.
And Aliona, how is it for you to watch and see this? I can only imagine it's heartbreaking.
It is definitely very difficult to watch from afar, as you say, because the overwhelming feeling that doesn't go away is complete helplessness. And even though there has been almost 24/7 non-stop work with a strong volunteer sector here in London that's being conducted by a Ukrainian social club, we have close cooperation with the embassy, who's been most helpful with trying to liaise with various NGOs here in London, businesses, donors that are willing to donate lots of money, medical aid, supplies, and for now, at least, it's been rewarding to see that almost hundreds of thousands of pounds have already been donated towards Ukrainian cause and shipped to Ukraine in one way or another, in one form or the other. Loads of humanitarian aids being sent to Ukraine every single day. Dozens of trucks leave London every single day. But it's still very difficult nonetheless, because for me personally, for example, having arranged and gone through all of this organizing of humanitarian aid being provided and shipped to Ukraine. My brother is on the front line now, and I don't know where he is exactly because he, of course, is not allowed to notify anyone. But it's been a personal struggle of trying to get some even defensive ammunition to him personally, and there's absolutely no way I can do it. And I know that there are shortages in their military unit, and there's no way to resupply that.
Hearing that is awful, and I just don't think anyone could listen to that without wanting to help do whatever we can to support Ukraine. The British government today has introduced sanctions on another 350 oligarchs, but what more is there beyond what's doing that we can do? What's our message right now for government to say these are the things you need to be getting on with?
Well, it's rather to frame this question, can you actually do something like a decision on a non-flying zone or at least a partial closure of the sky around the nuclear power plants or in some part of Western Ukraine? And I know that there are limits to this in terms of the standing of NATO member states. And I have to say this said reality that probably at some point I could understand our president saying that Ukraine as a country with the strong and fearless army is not fencing joining weak military unions. So in terms of practical things that we're asking right now, definitely the most fragile situation is with our air defense system. However, our anti-air systems proved to be quite effective, but they're not in sufficient numbers. So this is something that we're really keep asking our Western partners to help with, and also some military and fighting jets. And I know that these issues are being elaborated, and we have some positive developments on this range. Also, with regard to sanctions, first of all, I have to say that it's really the level, the scale, and the coherence of sanctions applied by European countries and America and other countries of the Western world are unbeatable and unseen in the past, and also which strike us, and we welcome this, that international business aligned with these boycotts. And the companies which are joining this trend, getting more and more, and at some point we even given up of just putting them into one single list because there's so many. So on practical side, we still would be looking for a complete embargo of export of oil and gas from Russia. This would help us, and the ban of for Russian commercial vessels to port in international seaports. So the other countries here should follow the UK example as well.
Fantastic. Well, What I'm now going to do is I'm going to go and take some questions from you, our live studio audience. We might come back to questions here in the studio, but I want to give you a chance to get involved in our discussions. As I said at the beginning, there's a chance, if you've not yet asked your question, to ask one by clicking on the link under the video in the description. But our first question is from Edward Ben Nathan. Edward, if I might, could I get you to ask your question live?
Can you hear me?
I can, Edward.
I haven't got a question. Why did you think I had one?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. You joined the studio, Edward. Ben.
I just clicked the link on the email that you sent me.
No question from you. All right. Well,
no.
we will move on to a question from Malcolm War, if we could. Malcolm, do you have a question?
Yes, I think my question is centered around where we think we will be in about 6 months' time. Clearly, there's a lot of emotion around what is going on between Ukraine and Russia. I'd like to see what the panel think will be the position in about 6 months' time, and whether there will be any resolution in some form by then.
Okay, looking ahead, Aliona, where do we think we will be within 6 months?
I do think, or at least hope, that the situation will be quite different in 6 months to what it is now, simply because there is absolutely no chance that Russia could sustain an active military assault for the next 6 months. We don't see any chance for Russia to have a full-scale conscription and mobilization of their whole population. They're running out of troops, and they're running out of military hardware, which is an extremely positive thing. But also, there is a chance that Russian economy might not exist in 6 months. We're expecting Russian economy to default in about 2 weeks, or by mid-April, the latest. And then in June, I'm afraid there's not going to be much left of the market in Russia too, and that will certainly start affecting the Russian government and the Russian people as well, and will definitely urge them to think what Russia is doing in Ukraine that makes the world hit them so hard.
Okay, well, that was a clear answer. Let's take another question, if we can, from Andrew Brody. Andrew, perhaps you could ask your question.
To me, I have not asked for a question.
Okay, let's move straight on to a question from Gary Ryant, if we could. Gary Ryant.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you. I'd like your thoughts, please, on the implementation of a no-fly zone.
No-fly zone. It's a topic that's been well discussed. Aliona, perhaps I could start with you, and then I'll go to Yuliia. The argument for it is obviously it would stop airstrikes against civilians. The argument against it, and of course help Ukraine in its potential victory. The argument against it, of course, is it risks drawing NATO into potentially existential nuclear conflict. Where do you come down on it? Is it a good idea, bad idea, or are there some alternatives that are some of the way along?
There are many alternatives to this. There have been many discussions on pros and cons of no-fly zone here in the West in the recent 10 days at least. We do understand the risks. Nobody wants to prompt in a new nuclear war to happen, or the Third World War, of course. But we also have to understand that for some reason, the West is always lagging behind. It's always one step behind Russia and its threats. And I think it needs to catch up. The West is trying to play a game of chess with someone who is playing a game of poker. That's why these approaches cannot align, and they're not sustainable in the long term. On the other hand, we could also implement the no-fly zone, as you say, partially or regionally. We could have a no-fly zone over the nuclear power stations. I'm sure that could be negotiated even with Russia through international agencies, and that's still not a full-on no-fly zone. And just like the Henry Jackson Society briefing offered a week ago or so, to implement a no-fly zone over a humanitarian area, say in the west of Ukraine, just to protect the civilians from the enormous atrocities that Russian forces are causing.
Yuliia.
On question of non-flying zone, we also heard some assessment from Ukrainian military that it will help, but it won't help much because Russians still have the capacity to shoot missiles from their territory, and it means that you can't shoot a plane flying on Russian or Belarusian territory, and that still makes us vulnerable to airstrikes and to missiles. So the Ukrainian side is pressing with more anti-air defense systems as probably compromise between NATO non-readiness to provide us with this non-flying zone, and also to have our anti-air defense system strengthened. And another issue is that if you're talking about the argument of NATO states that they don't want to get into direct conflict with a nuclear power like Russia, if you still can refrain from a direct conventional war with Russia on Ukraine territory, but it doesn't mean that if Russia is using tactical nuclear bombs or using nuclear power plants as their hostages and blackmailing with ecological catastrophe, that the European continent won't be affected by the consequences of this.
And should perhaps the West draw a red line for Russia to say that, look, this is our position up to now. We've said what we will do and what we won't do. But were Russia to cross the Rubicon of using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons, that actually the West would have to reevaluate, and that would be Russia crossing a line, and the West in those circumstances would have to step in more comprehensive ways?
Well, I think that the Western countries won't be drawing these red lines just because they understand that Russia will be breaking them, and they would be obliged to do some response which they don't want to provide. So I think that this is a very tricky issue, and everybody understands this game.
Thank you, Yuliia. Another question, if we might. This one is a bit of a special treat for regular viewers. It's a question from the eponymous Dr. Alan Mendoza. Alan, welcome back to the show, your show, really. What would you like to ask our guests?
Well, hello, folks. Sorry, that COVID had other plans for me today than being in the studio. Interesting discussion. I want to ask a sort of tough question in the sense of, obviously, we hope this conflict gets resolved with Russia retreating, withdrawing, and everything going back to status quo ante. In fact, we also hope Russia will withdraw from Crimea and eastern provinces. But in the realm of the real, a deal might have to be done. What do you both think would be acceptable terms for Ukraine? Or rather, let me put it a different way. What would Ukraine want to be coming out of that deal with realistically? Let's not talk about specifics about this territory or that territory, but what would you want to see a free Ukraine in the future looking like? In particular, I'm thinking, would you be happy to accept, or would you want some formalized tie with the West?
It's a really, Alan is right. It is a tough question. Yuliia, straight over to you there.
Yeah, I've been asked already this question a couple of times today, so I'm demanding to be a bit prepared for in answers. So there currently is speculation about which positions Ukraine is ready to sacrifice in order to get Russian consent to get all the troops withdrawn from Ukraine and immediate ceasefire. And they're talking about withdrawing the aspirations for NATO membership. But here, our president and his team started talking about some legally binding guarantees, security guarantees for the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Then the question comes about, are we talking about borders before 2014 or after? But in any case, the issue has been framed differently. So we're not talking about NATO as the only tool for guaranteeing security for Ukraine. But we need some instrument which could bind Russia and make this legally binding for them, with some sanctions envisaged in case they will breach their commitments. And Russians are also stepping down a bit from the initial demands right now on a relatively minor question, because initially they stated that their goal was to denazificate Ukraine, means getting rid of the existing government. But right now they entered into negotiations with the existing government, which means that they actually de facto legalized it, and they withdrawn this claim from their negotiation package. But still, very painful issues like issue of Crimea and recognition of so-called independent people republics, I think will be the most painful one to discuss. And from what I see, the priority of issues that Ukrainian side and Russian side are putting on the negotiation table, they're completely different. So I think that it would be very harsh, still will be very harsh debates within the negotiation track.
It sounds like Yuliia there is talking about, I guess, a Budapest memorandum with some teeth,
Budapest memorandum
with some teeth.
Yes, was not legally binding.
Correct.
That's the problem. Yeah.
But leaving open there the option of, I guess, recognition of certain territories that have been taken forcibly, militarily, by Russia, do not seem, from what we can see of mass protests on the street, they don't wish to be in Russia. They wish to be Ukrainian. That's why they're all going and standing on tanks, displaying huge bravery. It is the reality that we've kind of just got to give up on them a little bit and, accept that. Is that where we are? Is that the deal that's going to have to be struck? That we're going to have to, in order to save some of Ukraine, do a deal that loses those people for the foreseeable future to a totalitarian state?
I think the Ukrainians will never agree to losing its people to a totalitarian state. That's one thing that has become very clear over these last 20 days of war in Ukraine. Ukrainians are not giving up that easily. There are many other issues on the negotiations table that I think can be tackled. First of all, the strongest bargaining chip for Ukrainians are also sanctions. Sanctions that are imposed by the West that are destroying Russian economy and are leading it down into complete unexistence, basically. So it's not just the weak points that Ukraine can stand by. If the Russians initially came into Ukraine saying that they're going to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and demand for its neutral status, I think President Zelensky has also already been clear on the fact that Ukraine might not want to join NATO. First of all, the doors that has many times said to be open was not open at the very end. And we are now happy to go with a legally binding security agreement, which is quite possible. And I think that is the reasonable way to go about it. So that's one objective for Russia achieved, to report back to their massive propaganda machine. B, demilitarization. I mean, the war obviously got rid of lots of military hardware in Ukraine, so they could claim that and twist that message however they want. And they could perhaps look at easing or lifting some sanctions, or perhaps rethinking their approach towards Russia. And inevitably, I think as soon as Russian forces go all the way back down to the borders of 24th of February, if all the atrocities and killings and mass murderings of Ukrainians stop, I think then realistically it's just going to be a matter of time for Russia to collapse as a state. I don't think that Putin's government has long time to stay in power. Some experts are saying 1 year, 2 years tops. And then we can go back to negotiating on the republics in the East and Crimea.
Well, thank you for that, Aliona, and thank you, Yuliia. That's all we've got time for today. We close with the prediction from Aliona here that Putin's regime might fall very soon indeed. I think in the bleakest of times, that is the one prospect that offers us hope that in the end, no dictator stands forever, that there is the prospect of a free Russia and a free Ukraine living and trading in peace one day. And the sooner that the West can bring that about, the better. Thank you very much for joining us. Please join us next week on The Scoop with Alan Mendoza, who hopefully will then be back from his COVID-induced separation from you all. Thank you and good night.